So my presentation is on minimum wage policy. So what is minimum wage policy? It's an economic tool that imposes a price floor on wages, ensuring a certain minimum requirement of remuneration to be given to employees. It's set by the government, usually with the input of labor unions and business organizations. And in order to be effective, it must be binding. So employers must pay at least the minimum wage with no exceptions. Looking at objectives and implementation, it was created and implemented by Congress under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and it was bred out of necessity in the wake of the Great Depression. In the 1930s, the excess of labor supply exceeded demand, and the non-existent bargaining power of desperate low-wage workers allowed for minute wages to be given to employees. So its core objectives were protecting workers, stabilizing the economy, and aiding the poor. So how has the minimum wage changed over the years? It's increased many times since 1938, but increases have become less frequent over time. The most recent increase was to $7.25 in 2009, which is estimated to be worth 30% less now in 2023 than it was when the increase happened. So while the nominal value of the minimum wage has been increasing, the real value of the minimum wage has decreased, reducing purchasing power. And this has led many to question whether minimum wage is still a suitable policy that achieves the aims on which it was created. Looking at its effects on the labor market, first looking at perfect competition as displayed in the graph. Without minimum wage, the equilibrium wage level and employment level falls where labor supply meets labor demand, which is denoted by the orange line on the graph. After implementation, labor supply exceeds labor demand, resulting in unemployment where the blue line hits labor demand and labor supply. So while employment decreases, the wage level, which is set above the equilibrium, increases. Looking at its effects on the labor market in an imperfect competitive market, in this monopsony market, it has the adverse effect. So before implementation, firms demanded labor at LM, denoted on the graph, where marginal revenue equals marginal factor cost, and pays a wage of $4 in this example, where this crosses the labor supply curve. After minimum wage is implemented of $5 in this example, labor supply increases to L1 and the marginal factor of product curve is horizontal up until this quantity of labor. As such, in this situation, both wages and employment increase. There are some arguments against minimum wage in that it reduces employment through the substitution of workers and an incentive for new workers to enter the labor force that I'm going to discuss now. So looking at reduced employment through the substitution of workers, minimum wages are binding, so employers technically can't hire cheaper labor at this level below the minimum wage. However, low-skilled jobs are most commonly associated with low wages, and they can be more easily substituted for capital. Some examples of these are self-checkouts at grocery stores, drive-through fast food dining, and customer service chatbots, all of which have been implemented and reduced the need for low-skilled workers and most likely also low-wage workers. Employers find more cost-effective ways to operate, and this can cause unemployment. Looking at new net entrants into the labor market, the minimum wage is higher than the equilibrium wage. So when it's implemented, people who opted out of the labor market because the equilibrium wage did not equal their reservation wage, which is where they're indifferent between working and not working, they are now willing to work. This increases the labor supply even further, causing some people to lose jobs to new entrants and others to now be considered unemployed as new members of the labor force. Looking at arguments supporting the minimum wage, they're very similar to its aims, that it protects workers, aids the poorest of the population, and stabilizes the economy. Looking at how it can protect workers, it can prevent workers from being exploited like a situation in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when they were being paid very little or nothing. It can it can account for inflationary pressures, as increases tend to coincide with increases in inflation, which can improve the standard of living for some people. Looking at how it can aid the poorest of the population, theoretically, it's rational to assume that the poorest of the population are those paid the lowest. So it has the potential to increase standard of living, bring low-income families out of poverty, and reduce reliance on welfare benefits. It's also said to reduce income inequality, as hiring the price floor, increasing the price floor, reduces the gap between the highest and lowest paid workers of our society. It's also said to stabilize the economy, as it can stimulate economic growth by increasing consumer spending. And in terms of government implementation, it's a low cost and easily implemented economic policy. Unlike others that were looked at in the class, there's very little administrative work in implementing this policy, because people don't need to opt in or out of it. Nor does the government have to calculate how much people will be receiving, like a tax or a tax credit. So looking at empirical evidence on how well it actually achieves its objectives in the real world, I'll examine arguments for and against minimum wage policy through an empirical lens, particularly the questions of whether it protects workers, aids the poorest of the population, and reduces employment. Looking at how it can protect workers, in a modern context where labor supply rarely exceeds labor demand to the extent it did when minimum wage was conceived, it may not seem as effective as it was then. But an example in St. Louis, where labor supply has exceeded demand for the last 20 years, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's a huge decrease in labor demand, it's clearly still relevant in certain situations. While this is a rare case in the US, it's not in other places, so it still works to protect workers when there is an excess of supply in this situation. Looking at how it can aid the poor, evidence varies across studies. One study found that an increase to $4.25 can decrease the poverty gap for low-income families by 11% and decrease the number of families in poverty by 8.7%. This 1990 study also found that in 1986, only 10% of low-wage teens and 18% of low-wage adults belonging to poor families were receiving the minimum wage. The same study did find that a positive effect on income families would be more effective if the minimum wage was better at targeting the poor and not teens. Another study found that minimum wage produces a tax effect that allocates the benefits of higher earnings evenly across all levels, as well as causing increases in higher wages. So both of these studies find that it doesn't work hugely in aiding the poor or reducing inequality. While there is some evidence to support that it aids the poor, the general consensus is that it isn't high enough or good enough at targeting to really achieve the same. Looking at its reduction of unemployment, as we saw in the labor market, it is expected to reduce employment in situations where a market is perfectly competitive. But in the real world, evidence has changed over time. Original thinking is that it reduced employment, with a 25-year time series study finding a 10% increase in minimum wage reduced employment by between 1% and 3%. However, later findings from a study of fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania suggested a small positive employment effect. More recent studies, like the study from the US Census Bureau data, from before and after the 1996 minimum wage changes, found no effect on employment. So minimum wages overall seem to cause a very small reduction in employment that's almost negligible, and in some cases, it can even cause an increase in employment, like in the fast food study. It's important to note that these studies also found that minimum wage implementation impacted teenagers more than low-income workers or families. giving added impetus to the point that it doesn't achieve its aim of aiding the poor. So looking towards the future and improving the minimum wage. Most empirical studies I referred to found that minimum wage implementation and increases fail to target the poorest of families and workers, instead impacting mostly teens and other workers that do not come from low-income households. When implemented, workers from low-income households can be more likely to face unemployment, and they can be substituted for capital or higher skilled workers, though this effect tends to be small. So many studies agreed that minimum wage as a policy to protect workers and reduce poverty could work, but it needs to target the people who need it, be large enough to make a real impact on poverty levels, and forms of job security need to be implemented in conjunction with it. This has sparked recent discourse about a living wage, whereby people are provided a minimum wage based on where they live, so that people living in New York versus North Carolina are not being given the same minimum wage, as the cost of living is massively different. So this is a possible way for the minimum wage to transform in the future to better achieve its aims.